incident there. And the most common fluorophore, as we all know, is FITC, which gives a green fluorescence when blue light is incident on it. And apart from this, recently some institutes have also started using Alexa Fluor and Taxis Red. Alexa Fluor has almost the same excitation spectrum as the FITC and can be replaced it and has a better fluorescence and longer life, although it's slightly expensive. And some if you want to use a double immunofluorescence, you can also use Texas Red. So these are the three main fluorophores which are used and tagged to the antibodies. Now this is the basic structure of the immunofluorescence microscope. So most of the microscopes if you use are Epi fluorescence microscopes. So the light source emits the light from above, falls on the surface wherever we are trying to see, and then is reflected back, and then we see it in the ocular lens. So so basically, what antibody should you have in your lab? So if you're doing an immunofluorescence examination, there is a basic set of antibodies which you should be having in your laboratory, and this includes very systematically the heavy chains, of which IgA, IgG, and IgM have to be used. You need to use the complement components, which includes C3, the early, and the C1q, the late complement component, and of course both the light chains, kappa and lambda. And apart from this, you can optionally use albumin and fibrinogen, which are useful in a subset of cases. And I would suggest each and every renal pathology laboratory to try and introduce the IgG subclasses also. So the G1, G2, G3, and G4, as they give a lot of insight into the diseases where IgG is the immune reactant. So you can get a lot of information regarding the pathophysiology and the nature of the disease when you do these subclasses. And some laboratories also do C4D by the immunofluorescence technique. You can have that. So these are the basic antibodies which you should be having. There are a lot of others which can be done on a research or other basis, but for a diagnostic workup, this is the basic repertoire which you should have. Now coming to the interpretation. Now the basic aim of interpreting immunofluorescence is to detect fluorescence which is resulting from a specific reaction. Most commonly is the antigen antibody reaction which gives rise to this reaction. So the main steps as we do in the routine biopsy is we have to do a systemic examination. So the first we will assess the adequacy of the biopsy, look at the cortex, glomeruli, medulla, whatever, just like we do in a light microscopic examination. We need to do that in IF as well. And another important step is judging the adequacy of staining. So sometimes what happens, the tissue is not well preserved. So what you see as negative is actually not a true negative. So you with training, with the time, you will be able to assess the adequacy of tissue preservation also, especially in those laboratories which receive samples from far off locations. So this is a very, very important practical point which needs to be taken up. Then, as the LM, we have to evaluate systematically the glomeruli, the tubules, the interstitium, and the blood vessels. So one by one, we go these things and then try to interpret and form an opinion regarding the whole process. Now, as Dr. Seshan had pointed out, there are three basic principles of evaluation of direct immunofluorescence, and this will apply to whatever compartment of the kidney we are looking at. So first is the intensity of the staining. So most of the labs use from 0 trace, 1 plus, 2 plus, 3 plus. That's 3 plus is the maximum intensity, and some labs also use up to 4 plus. So it depends on which position or which place you are practicing. We use 3 plus as the maximum intensity. The second step would be to assess the location of staining. So it could be glomerular, of course. It's a very glomerulocentric kind of an examination, but at the same time, we should not lose sight of the other compartments like the tubular basement membranes, Bowman's capsule, the interstitium, the interstitial cells, the tubular cytoplasm, the cellular nuclei which are infiltrating which are present in the biopsy, all have to be looked at. And thirdly, you assess the pattern of stain. So the pattern could be granular, confluent, linear, smudgy. So this is the three basic steps in which you have to perform ODF evaluation: the intensity, the location, and the pattern in whatever way you want. So first, most of the times you assess the intensity, then you look at the location, and then you tell what pattern that staining is happening. So we will take up these things one by one. So intensity of staining, as I just told, is generally scored from trace to 3 plus, and some institutes actually prefer 4 plus. It's important to realize here that grades actually do not define any specific disease entity per se. But however, when we talk about them in these semi-quantitative terms, these are helpful in differential diagnosis of a few entities. So when we talk about an IgA dominant IRGM, for example, the dominant heavy chain is IgA, but the intensity of IgA is usually less than C3. So That's where the semi-quantitative grading comes into play. So you have to be very careful and uniformly apply this grading to all the biopsies. Also in C3 glomerulopathy, as we know, you can have some amount of IgA, IgG or IgM staining. And when we look at that, we should be very careful that that C3 staining should be at least 2 semi-quantitative grades higher than whatever the heavy chain stain. So there again, you have a role for the semi-quantitative staining pattern. So uniformity in maintaining the semi-quantitative grade, something you learn with time, but has to be diligently followed. So this composite picture will just give you an idea of how you use the negative to 3+ immunofluorescence grading. So negative, you won't see any immunofluorescence. Trace, the intensity as well as the distribution is in this case is very light. So if you go on comparing from 1+, 2+, 3+, the intensity of and usually the distribution of the immune complexes gradually keeps on increasing. So this is the way you will quantify most of the immunofluorescence staining patterns. So whether it is capillary wall, mesangial, whatever, the staining intensity has to be uniformly scored. So we'll just take this up one by one. As we just said, the glomerular staining pattern is slightly different. We talk about them in a slightly different term than the extraglomerular pattern. When we talk about the glomeruli, we try to localize the staining. So whether it is mesangial, whether it is along the capillary walls, or is it occurring at both places together? And as in light of recent developments, we also need to look at the podocyte cytoplasm. I'll come to that in a while. We'll take up the examples. And when we talk about the extraglomerular staining, so that's one thing which you need to pay attention in the background. You need to look at the tubular basement membranes, the Bowman's capsule, the tubular cytoplasm, the intratubular casts, the interstitial area, the inflammatory cells and blood vessels. So whatever is there in a biopsy, basically you need to be very careful about. Don't miss anything. Do not neglect anything. That's the basic fundamental of doing IF examination. So coming to the location, so this is a typical example of mesangial staining. So you look at the peripheral capillaries, you hardly see any staining. There is no staining. Most of the green fluorescence you see is there in the mesangial. So this is a typical mesangial staining pattern. Now, if you look at this picture, in contrast to what we've seen in the earlier one, the staining is predominantly in the capillary. So this we call as a capillary wall pattern staining. Now in this picture, you see staining at both the locations. If you look carefully, you can look at the mesangial areas also. There are dots in mesangial areas as well as in the capillary. So mesangial as well as capillary wall stain. So this is the dual staining pattern. And recently, I'll make a passing mention of this. A dusty granular staining of podocyte cytoplasm has been described as an autoimmune reaction to patients with nephrin antibodies having nephrotic syndrome. So it's a good idea to just have a look at the podocyte cytoplasm also and see if there is any dusty granular staining. Just be careful not to mistake it for capillary wall deposits. And this is a specific staining pattern which will in coming days will often note more and have more knowledge about. So if you put the three images together, you can clearly see the difference. The mesangial, the capillary wall, and the mixed pattern of mesangial and capillary wall. You can clearly see the difference in staining. Now, second step is the pattern of staining. So we saw the location. Now we come to the pattern. So the pattern could be, there are basically four main patterns, right? Granular, linear, a pseudo-linear pattern, and a confluent or smudgy pattern. The granular can be subdivided into fine and coarse, and that has implications in the diagnostic algorithm. Fine granular represents something else. Coarse granular usually represents something else. So we'll come to that. So we take the same picture again. We just saw this in terms of deposits location. Now, if you look at the pattern, the leftmost you can see mesangial pattern is both granular and confluent. So you can call it a granular and confluent staining. So when smaller deposits coalesce, they give a confluent kind of appearance. And this is typical of an IgA nephropathy. The middle picture shows a predominantly capillary wall fine granular pattern, and this is a typical picture of a membranous nephropathy. The subepithelial deposits can usually give rise to a granular fine pattern. And the third one, which is usually called as the starry sky pattern with coarse granular capillary wall and mesangial deposits. And this is a common finding you see in infection related. So if you pay attention to the pattern of immunofluorescence, you can actually judge what's the disease process happening even before you look at the light microscope. Some more patterns. So in this picture, you can easily see a very linear kind of a pattern. So this is a linear pattern, and the giveaway is the crescent here. So to pay attention. So even in an IF, you should make an attempt to look at crescents, whether they are there or not. It will help you in your light microscopic examination. This is a typical picture of an anti-GBM disease. The picture on the right is a typical picture of diabetes. So diabetes gives a very smudgy kind of a pseudo-linear staining around the tubular and the glomerular basement membranes. So if you look at the intensity between, this is also linear. We call it pseudo-linear because number one, it is not so intense, and then it occurs in a different setting. It's basically intravenous. And if you really want to differentiate these two, you can do an albumin staining. So albumin would be positive in these areas, negative. So if you can differentiate a linear from a pseudo-linear staining by doing an albumin staining. Now this is another pattern of coarse granular staining, which you see. So this picture is showing coarse granular mesangial and capillary wall pattern. And you also see some ring-like mesangial ring pattern. So if you come across this pattern, you may be dealing with the C3GL. So just make a note of it while you do the examination. And the picture on the right is a typical picture where you get in a fibrillary. So it's a smudgy kind of a mesangial and capillary wall staining. There is no typical granularity to it. It's just a smudgy kind of a staining. And once you look at this picture, you can actually suspect an IgG fibrillary gene. So most of the times it's IgG which gives this pattern in fibrillary gene. Now also coming to extraglomerular sites. So once we've had the glomeruli, we also simultaneously need to focus on the extraglomerular sites as well. And as you can see in this picture, there is a pan compartmental stain, right? You can see a glomerulus here, you can see tubules here, and you can see a vessel here. All three are staining in a granular pattern. This is typical of a lupus nephritis. Now, if you look at the right picture, the glomerulus appears negative, right? There is no staining there, but you see a lot of granular staining in the interstitial area. So once you encounter this pattern, your mind should be ready to analyze that this could actually be dealing with an IgG4 disease. So a lot of it's an autoimmune disease where you get a lot of tubular basement membrane deposits and plasma cells infiltrate. So now another extraglomerular staining pattern which has been recently described is happens in the anti-brush border antibody. So you get granular staining both along the brush borders, that's where I'm pointing to, and also along the tubular basement. So you get a dual staining granular pattern, and you can suspect this by looking at this pattern carefully. And it's an autoimmune disease and has antibodies to migalin. So another few uncommon, not uncommon actually, but worth mentioning points regarding extraglomerular staining are one which you can sometimes see in BK virus nephropathy. So sometimes what BK virus does is elicits a localized immune reaction to the virus, and antibodies and antigen complexes form and get deposited on the tubular basement membranes. And if you do an careful IF study, you can actually see these deposits along the tubular basement membranes. Even on a C4D stain, they would show up along the TBFs. The right picture shows a glomerulus with intense C3 staining, and if you look carefully, there are deposits also along the tubular basement. So in a case where you have an exclusive C3 staining, and you also see a lot of TBM staining, it is likely to be a C3GN, of course, and even amongst the C3GN, it is more likely to be a dense deposit. So this is just a correlatory analysis, but you should pay attention to the extraglomerular deposits also in a C3GN. So if you were to summarize these findings, the differential diagnosis of granular staining pattern in DIF studies of extraglomerular deposits will come to these entities. Of course, we saw lupus nephritis, IgG4 related disease with renal involvement, the anti-brush border disease which I just showed you, C3 glomerulopathy, mainly dense deposit disease. So it's rare for C3 glomerulonephritis to show extraglomerular staining pattern, but it does happen sometimes. The BKV nephropathy, which I just showed you, and there is a poorly defined entity of anti-TBM disease, which is an older description. Now, as we are gaining knowledge, these particular entities being subdivided into many other forms. So this is the differential diagnosis of extraglomerular granular staining in GI studies. Now, just to as a passing mention, I should also mention about the tissue ANA phenomena. So in patients with lupus nephritis or autoimmune disease for that matter, when they have very high titers of ANA antibodies, they can go and react with the nuclei. So you get a tissue ANA phenomenon, and this will reflect the pattern which we see in the serology at the indirect immunofluorescence, the speckled or whatever pattern is there. So it beautifully lights up the nuclei of the biopsy. This is a tissue ANA phenomena. You can see it even in absence of lupus nephritis in cases of scleroderma who are biopsied for reasons other than lupus nephritis or proteinuria. So very nice indicator of high circulating ANA titers. Now, of course, we do kappa and lambda. So a very important component of the whole diagnostic algorithm. And a very important application of this is in diagnosing the proliferative genes with monotypic deposits. So here you see lambda restricted proliferative gene. You have no staining for kappa and very intense staining for 3+ staining for lambda. So if you talk about the differentials in this glomerulopathies with monotypic deposits, you have a proliferative gene with monoclonal IgG, as we all know, PG and MID. Then cases of immunotactoid gene, fibrillary gene, cryoglobulinic gene, another entity of membranous like GN with monoclonal IgG kappa deposits, and primary amyloidosis, which are most majority of them are lambda restricted. So these form diseases which you can diagnose with the help of kappa and lambda staining pattern, the relative intensities of kappa and lambda. Not to forget CAS nephropathy, of course. So kappa and lambda staining will help you pick up the atypical CAS and correlate with your light microscopy. You can come to a diagnosis of kappa or lambda restricted whatever CAS nephropathy. Another aspect of a paraproteinemic disease is the light chain deposition. So the light chain deposit, what happens is light chain deposition is the light chains themselves get deposited in the renal interstitium and glomeruli. So they do not give a granular pattern. So these are not immune complexes. Most of the time, this pattern is linear. So you get a linear pattern along the TBMs and the GPMs of one of the chains, depending on what's circulating, monotypic kappa or lambda. So this is the light chain deposition disease. On the same corollary, you can have a heavy chain deposition disease also, where you get most commonly, which is IgG. So you get an IgG, and usually you will not get any kappa or lambda. If you get IgG and kappa or lambda, you can have a mixed heavy and light chain deposition. So this all depends on what is the clone which is circulating, which is present, which is giving rise to these light and heavy chain. You can have various combinations, which you can most of the times easily pick up on a careful IF examination. Now, no talk about IF in renal biopsies is complete without talking about the immunofluorescence on paraffin sections. So the Pronase treated paraffin sections, immunofluorescence on this particular tissue has actually revolutionized the whole algorithms. So each and every renal pathology laboratory has to standardize this particular process. So without this, not only will you not be able to salvage a lot of tissues which do not have enough glomeruli for IF examination, you would actually be missing some specific lesions. So, so this is of course an indispensable techniques. And apart from what I said just now, so there are now disease entities which you can only diagnose when you do a immunofluorescence on paraffin section, because the antigens in the original sections are masked. So you do an unmasking of the antigens by this technique, and like the entity I just mentioned, membranous like GN, you can get the reference in the bottom note. Membranous like GN with masked IgG kappa deposits. You can have an MPGN with masked monotypic immunoglobulin deposits. And there are certain cases of crystalline light chain proximal tubulopathy, which do not show any restriction on the routine sections. You have to do a Pronase digestion and look at it again in the microscope to actually realize that this is actually a light chain proximal tubulopathy. And there are some cases of glomerular and extraglomerular light chain amyloid deposits, which do not show up unless and until you do a paraffin embedded paraffin Pronase treatment on these sections. And not only renal tissue, you can actually extend the use of this technique to non-renal tissues which have monoclonal deposits. So it's a very, very versatile technique which each and every laboratory should standardize. So in the end, a few practical tips. So you need to train your mind to stick to the same pattern of grading always. It's difficult, I know. So especially when you change institutes, it happens with me. Some people come from outside, they have tendency to do it up to 4, but then you should stick to one particular pattern throughout your career. So that's the way you'll be able to reproduce all your findings. And it is also wise to remember that not all glomeruli may show the same intensity. It happens in IgA nephropathy. You see some glomeruli showing a lot of intensity staining and some are absolutely negative. So generally what will happen in such cases, the one with maximum intensity should be considered as diagnostic. And you should mention this in your report or findings which you mention. And also you should be wary for non-specific entrapment. So it is a wise thing to compare adjacent glomerulus. So you take each glomerulus at a time, do a very intensive study and compare each intensity in each glomerulus, and just be on lookout for any sclerosis which may confuse you with a positive staining. Still, if you have any doubt regarding the presence or other things about the glomeruli, do not hesitate to stain the DIF section with either HE or PAS and try to gain a knowledge about the morphology. So it's a very useful practice. Don't hesitate, even if it delays you by one day, it is worthwhile doing it in cases of doubt. And as I told earlier, never ignore even the faintest of staining at any level. So nothing has to be ignored in a DI examination, not even a trace staining, and it should be documented. So once you document it, and when you see your LMN IF, you will realize what is important, what is not important. But if you miss out at the first steps, most of the times you do the IF as the initial step, right? So if you miss out there, it's likely that it may reflect in your diagnosis of the end of the day also. So for the beginners, so electron microscopy is one technique which is not available, unfortunately, at many locations. So this is one thing which gets missed out even in training in a lot of places. So need to be aware, and you try to gain as much knowledge from these talks and other things as possible. So it's a special microscope which of course allows examination at very high magnification resolution, and this is predominantly because we are using electrons as the source of light. So because they have a very short wavelength, you get a lot of resolution. So that's the basic idea of using electron microscope. So when we talk about electron microscope in diagnostic pathology, we talk about TEM, right? We talk about transmission electron microscope, but that's not the only kind of electron microscope. We should also be aware about the scanning electron microscope, which is not used in diagnostic pathology per se. But what basic difference between these two is the amount of voltage which is used to accelerate the electron beam. So in TEM, we use a very high electron beam voltage so that the beam can actually pass through a section. That's why it's called transmission electron microscope. Whereas on scanning electron microscopy, because the voltage of the beam is low, it just gets reflected. And you can see the surface of the whatever you want to see in a very, very detailed observation. So just next 3-4 slides are actually trying to emphasize on the utility of electron microscopy in renal pathology. So it's been there for a long time. As long as renal pathology has been there, we've been using electron microscope. But since its availability is limited, there have been a lot of questions whether it should be used or it should not be used. But if you look at the literature right from the beginning, we started using it actually in late 60s and early 70s. There has been no doubt that electron microscopy should be an integral part of the whole diagnostic environment. So that goes without saying. So even as early as 1978, they could actually find a lot of new diagnoses when they actually reprocessed the older diagnosis, older blocks. Another paper. So if you look at most of these papers, almost 75% of the cases, your diagnosis are either confirmed, re-emphasized, or you make a new diagnosis while doing electron microscopy. So it's an important component. Now, if you look at this particular chart, these are few examples of diseases which you can diagnose. The ones in bold red are the ones you cannot make without an electron microscopy examination. So barring a few here, which we like February gene, we have IHC now, but many of these diseases you cannot diagnose without electron microscope. So that emphasizes the utility of this technique. Now, allograft pathology, the advent of transplantation, has actually cemented the position of electron microscopy further. So, as you all must be knowing, in 2013, there was a recommendation from the BAMF group that at those centers which are capable of doing electron microscopy, the ultrastructural studies should be performed in biopsies from patients who are sensitized or have documented TSA, or who have a previous biopsy showing C4D cell. So basically, sensitized patients, if you do a repeat biopsy, you should be doing an EM to judge whether how much endothelial damage has been done. And this led to a creation of a new CG1A definition, where you do not see any GBM reduplication by LM, but you can see it by electron microscopy. And a basic classification of peritubular capillary membrane multilayering was also adapted in that particular. So you need to have 7 layers in PTC and 5 in additional 2 to call it significant. And of course, if you talk in terms of transplant, the recurrent glomerular diseases, many of these are actually diseases which you need EM for diagnosis. So if you need it in the native disease, you will also need it in the recurrent disease also. So what I'll do quickly is I'll take 2 or 3 quick cases which will emphasize the importance of electron microscopy, and also introduce to a few classical cases which will be helpful for you in understanding the various patterns of ultrastructural appearance. So the first case now, I'll just quickly go through these cases. This is a 1-year-old female child with nephrotic syndrome. She's presented with nephrotic syndrome, but she also has a lot of microscopic hematuria. So you can call it a nephritic kind of a syndrome, but she has normal renal functions, a lot of albumin, no hypertension, the complements are normal. And if you look at systemic examination, there is hardly anything contributing. And even the family members were screened and nothing abnormal was found. So the clinical impression was query MCD, query FSG because the clinical presentation was like of nephrotic. The only thing, she had a lot of hematuria. So this was the biopsy. You can see an absolutely normal glomerulus. This is a PA stain. Normal appearing glomerulus in a 1-year-old child. IF was negative, and when we did the electron microscopy, the GBMs were quite thin. So if you look at the lengths here, 156, 161, there were areas which were even thinner, 137, there were areas which were actually less than 100. So, and if you look at carefully at the visceral epithelial fluid process, they are effaced. So this is correlating with the degree of proteinuria the child was having. Even here you can see there is a fair amount of effacement of the processes. So there is a podocytopathy, and although the child is only 1 year old, you could sense that GBMs are not normal. So when we did we took 3 glomeruli and a lot of measurement, the mean GBM thickness came to 131 nanometer. And there were no alterations of collagen arrangement to suspect Alport or anything like that. And there was a lot of effacement, as we just now saw, of the food processes. And there were no electrons deposits. So the overall impression was a minimal change-like disease, podocytopathy, with query thin glomerulus. The problem why I'm putting a query here is that criteria for GBM thickness values and definition of thin GBMs are not well standardized in children less than 3 years. So there's a problem there. So children have thinner GBMs at birth, which progressively gain in thickness. But to define a thin GBM at this age, it is a very difficult because we don't have criteria to define. So what happened later on? This child was treated. She was treated with steroids. There was partial remission of proteinuria, but hematuria persisted. And she was actually started on CNI at 4 years, but there was no significant remission. And then, since there was persistent microscopic hematuria, she was again rebiopsied at 5 years of age. Now, when the biopsy was done this time, we found a FSGS lesion. So there is an FSGS which has developed. There was nothing in the initial biopsy. There is a FSGS which has happened now. IF was negative again. Now you look at the EM. So you can imagine here. So this is a nice effacement of food processes, a lot of podocytopathy, right? But the GBMs are still appearing quite thin. So now she's 5 years old. The length you can see 183. And in addition, apart from what we had not seen earlier, you could see some capillaries with this GBM alterations. So you can see the breakdown of the lamina densa into multiple electron lesion zones, the crisscross pattern, the basket weave pattern, everything had developed focal. So over a period of time, the thin GBM disease had developed into a full-blown, or not even a full-blown, an Alport disease which was progressing further. So now we had FSGS lesions, IFLM negative, variation of GBM thickness, and GBM collagen alterations, respective of Alport disease. Along with that, there was a podocytopathy which had persisted even in the last biopsy. And genetics did show a call for a mutation, but it was of unknown pathogenicity. But with the overall scenario, you can very well realize what has happened. So a child who had a thin basement disease diagnosis over a period of time has shown full-blown lesions of Alport. So basically, they are two sides of the same coin. So just a word on this. Nanometer and progressively we increase. And it's important to realize that early biopsies in Alport disease may reveal only thin GBM. So that calls for a very diligent examination. So even if the child is 1 year old or a few months old, we should not hesitate in measuring the GBM thickness. It may have significance later on in the disease process. So one more case, one last case. So this is a 42-year-old male. Now this is another important manifestation where you can use electron microscopy, the importance of electron microscopy in diagnostic algorithm. So this gentleman had a nephrotic nephritic illness 7 months back, right? And elsewhere, the renal biopsy was diagnosed as a diffuse proliferative GN, IgG C3, AM C1q negative, light chains were not performed, and EM was not done. So looking at the overall picture, it was diagnosed as an infection-related GN. But what happened? There was no resolution of proteinuria and hematuria, and there was progressive renal dysfunction. And in view of this, there was a repeat biopsy which was planned at another center. So this is the second biopsy which I'm showing you. So you can actually see, there is a proliferative GN. You can see lobulations and other things. And you can also see thickening of GBM. There are confluent deposits. The overall picture was that of an MPGN now. It was not a DPGN. There was thickening and reduplication had set in. When you look at the IF was showing IgG C3, and there was a monotypic kappa. So it was an IgG1 kappa kind of a proliferative. So PGN-MID, if you call, if you're not doing an electron microscopy, it's a case of an Ig PGN-MID. But when we did the electron microscopy, there was something here. So if this is a low power view, I'll just come to the higher power. So there were parallel bundles and arrays of tubular structures, which were hollow core. So the diagnosis was actually an immunotactoid gene. So this is one very important application of electron microscopy in diagnosing so-called organized deposits. So the morphology was MPGN, IgG1 kappa type. And when you further worked up this patient, there was a faint M band, and bone marrow flow cytometry showed an IgG kappa circulating. So had it not been a repeat biopsy and EM studies, we would have gone with the diagnosis of an IRGN. The patient would have landed with the wrong diagnosis and follow. So to conclude, the importance of EM in kidney biopsy diagnosis, of course, cannot be overemphasized, and it is useful in about 75% of the cases. And it's important to guarantee this option to all the patients. And what's not happening right now is also that training in EM should be a part of at least an option in the whole clinical curriculum globally.